Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing, I hope you're having a fantastic day. And hopefully, I'm about to make that day even better, as I tell you that I have spent dozens and dozens of hours testing every single weapon in the DLC to bring you a definitive ranking of all melee weapons in the entirety of Shadow of the Erdtree, along with exactly how good they are and how each one stacks up in comparison to the rest of them. And I know that the first question many of you may be asking yourselves, especially if you're new here, is why should we listen to you? You could have just stuck them in any old order and now you're just yapping on about it for an hour for views. And you are right to be skeptical, of course. I know a heck of a lot of creators who do this. They create... I probably shouldn't swear this early on in the video or the algorithm's gonna hate me. They create total shit because they know sheeple will watch just because they say it with authority or with a deep ASMR voice. So, the reason you should listen to me is because I am a hardcore gamer through and through. It's literally my only hobby. I genuinely adore this game and try to know everything about it that I possibly can. I put 200 hours into the DLC before it even launched. I defeated the Dancing Lion on my first try at the preview event in Paris, and I have become so comfortable with the game in 2,000 hours that I decided to start doing challenge runs. And as just a few examples for you, I have completed the game with nothing but crafting items such as throwing pots. On another run, I completed the game with nothing but a bow. Absolutely no other forms of damage was allowed, just a bow. And even with nothing but spirit ashes, I wasn't even allowed to attack in this run. I called it the Pokemon Trainer run. And that is just a few of the challenges I have done, so that you know, at least for the most part, I'm not entirely talking out of my arse. So now I wanted to share this knowledge and experience with you, and help you to learn the absolute best weapons in the game, so that you know what to focus on for your next playthrough. Sorry, I know this intro is going on a bit, but there's a lot of pretext you need for this video, so one more thing I wanted to share with you is that this footage has all been recorded at max level, with all weapons fully upgraded to ensure complete fairness with all of my testing. And on top of that, I'm not using a single piece of weapon enhancing equipment, such as armor sets, buffs, or talismans, to make sure that these results are completely fair and accurate. So without any further ado, let's blitz through the real dregs of the list, the super garbage weapons that you can completely ignore, so that you don't bother wasting your precious runes and upgrade materials on them. We have got 80 weapons to cover, so I'm going to go through these first few as quick as I possibly can. So firstly, the worst weapon in the DLC. I know so many people are going to be devastated with this. It is unfortunately the Golem Fist. As far as its actual stats and damage output go, it is abysmal compared to pretty much every other fist in the game. And the one thing you'd think would be a redeeming factor is the fact that it has been carved with Smith script, enabling the strong attacks to launch the entire fist ahead at your opponents. The only problem with this is it does about as much damage as a damp noodle. So unfortunately, Golem Fist, you are at the bottom of the list. Goodbye, my friend. Next up is the Serpent Flail. Long story short, flails are terrible. It is such a shame to have to say this, because I'm not someone that wants to write off a weapon immediately before using it just because of the category of weapon it's in. But genuinely, even as far as flails go, this is a really bad one. The moveset sucks, the damage sucks, it has an okay-ish Ash of War, but that's really all it is just okay. There is absolutely no reason for you to waste your time and effort on the Serpent Flail. Next up is the Blood Fiend's Fork, the worst of all the Blood Fiend's weapons, and probably the worst spear in the game. If you really want to try and make a Blood Fiend's weapon work, obviously use the Blood Fiend's Arm, which we will talk about way later in the list, as that one will probably be at least in the top 20. And if you really want to use a spear, there are far better spears. In fact, that's what you'll find with most of these low-tier weapons, is that not many weapons in the DLC are truly awful, but basically there are far better options. And why waste your time with a really lackluster option when you have something so much better just around the corner? And there are actually multiple incredible spears in the DLC, which obviously we'll get to later on in the list. For now, unfortunately, the Blood Fiend's Fork, due to your bad stats, your low blood loss build-up, and your boring-ass moveset, you stay here right down at the bottom. Next up in 4th or 77th, depending on how you're looking at the numbering of the list, is the Bonnie Butchering Knife. It is almost identical to the standard butchering knife in every single way possible. The attack rating, the guard rating, the stat requirements, the weight, the FP cost, everything. The only thing that sets it apart is its unique Ash of War, which is really, really, really bad. It grants you a tiny little bit of an extra HP restoration effect, and I think it maybe slightly increases the damage as well. But if you want a great axe, there are so many better options out there. This is such a subpar weapon. And rounding off the first 5 absolute worst weapons in the entire DLC is the Forked-Tongued Hatchet. Along with the Golem Fist, I covered this one in my rarest weapons video the other day, and again, it's just a gimmick weapon that doesn't really land. Even though it does have inherent blood loss buildup, this doesn't automatically apply to its unique skill. However, if you then infuse it with something like Blood Flame, it does. What? But even then, the skill is really slow and you can be staggered very easily whilst using it, and also it's very hard to control where you're aiming it. It's so mediocre because it sprays in an arc unless you are manipulating the camera, which means it's going to miss your target most of the time. And the base damage of the weapon itself is also very lackluster, so genuinely just a naff weapon. If you really want to use an axe, there are far better options further down the list. Up next is the Tooth Whip. A very bad weapon from a very bad weapon category. There are 1 or 2 okay whips in the game, and they're all from the base game. The Tooth Whip is not one of them. In fact, it is so mediocre and meh. The only reason this weapon ever gets talked about is for the admittedly quite interesting lore that the flavor text of this item gives you. But apart from that, it's a bad weapon from a bad weapon category. Do not bother with it. If you want a whip, there are much, much better ones. Next up, and I was actually considering putting this even lower down the list than it already is the Fire Spark perfume bottle. This is the perfect example of just a bad version of another already existing weapon. This is literally the Frenzy Flame perfume bottle, but with less damage and without any status effect. It's genuinely just terrible. It does the exact same damage type as the Frenzy Flame bottle, it just does less of it. And also the Frenzy Flame bottle inflicts madness buildup, whereas this inflicts nothing. There is literally no reason for this to exist. If you really want to use this weapon, just use the Frenzy Flame bottle. It's just better. Simple as that. Next up is the Dancing Blade of Rana. This falls into the same trap as the Fire Spark bottle that we just talked about, in that it only scales with one single stat. And late game, when you're level 250 or even just 200, scaling with one stat is very, very inefficient. And also, this whole unending dancing blade moveset is way too niche. It literally applies to this one weapon in the entire game, and unfortunately, it just doesn't do enough. It just falls a bit flat. Considering that the only way to make this weapon viable is by also wearing the accompanying armor set, that makes it very restrictive and very, very niche. If there were more dancing weapons and it was its own category, that would be a whole different ballpark. Unfortunately, it's just naff. At number 9, or number 72, is the Smith Script Axe. I really, really want to love Smith Script weapons. In fact, I've made a whole ass video on the Smith Script Great Hammer because I want that to be one of my favorite weapons in the game, and I'm trying so desperately to make it work. But unfortunately, especially because they were very quickly nerfed, the Smith Script aspect of these weapons doesn't do all that much. As you can see, the range is bad, the damage is bad, and it's got a boring moveset. Again, it's just another bleh weapon. If you want to use an axe, there are some incredible axes. Unfortunately, this ain't one of them. Before we proceed to the next weapon, I'd like to thank the sponsor for this video, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is available now for free on both PC and console. That means right now, without paying anything, you can immerse yourself in the intense combat of War Thunder, where incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. A feature I personally love is the hitboxes. War Thunder has one of the most sophisticated vehicle damage models in gaming. Every vehicle is intricately modeled down to its individual components, such as engines, fuel tanks, weapons, and crew. All are susceptible to damage and disabling from enemy fire, and different types of armor, shells, and missiles behave just like their real-world counterparts. In War Thunder, you can take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships of 10 different major nations. So if that all sounds amazing to you, then you can join the worldwide community of over 70 million players for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox by using my link in the pinned comment or video description down below. And please note that new and returning players who haven't played in 6 months or more will also receive a massive bonus pack across all platforms, and that's all available for a limited time only, so be quick. And rounding out at the 10th worst weapon in the game, we now have our 10 worst weapons in the game, is the Lizard Greatsword. Yes, it's the other new rare imp weapon drop. And again, if you want to use a greatsword, it's actually already one of the best, most fleshed out categories in the game. There are some top tier greatswords that are arguably the best weapons in the game. So trying to use this one just so you can spit a tongue at someone, it's really not something you want to do. Genuinely, its only redeeming quality is the fact that you can apply status effects to the forked tongue that you shoot out of the blade on the strong attack, and that's it. That's the only thing this weapon has going for it. It's unfortunately, for a rare drop, really, really bad. The 11th worst weapon in the game is the Carian Sorcery Sword. This is the new sword that also doubles as a catalyst for your spells. However, it loses its strong attack to gain the ability to do so, and it's a fairly lackluster catalyst. At specifically 41 intelligence, this is technically the most powerful catalyst in the game. However, that is a very, very niche thing to achieve to build your entire build around. And aside from that, regular staves are going to be better than this in all other situations. And when you talk about using this as an actual weapon, it's really not very good. So if you take away its ability to cast spells, which you probably want to because there are far better staves out there, then this just becomes a not particularly good thrusting sword. Combine that then with the fact that it deals a split between physical and magical damage. Magic damage is probably the most lackluster of all of the different damage types, as a fair few enemies are resistant to it. And even those that aren't particularly weak to it. It doesn't really exploit the weakness of a huge amount of enemies. So if you're looking at using this as a thrusting sword, there are some incredibly superior thrusting swords out there. Next on my list is the Lightning Bottle. For a similar reason to the Fire Spark Bottle, even lower down on this list, this is the only other perfume bottle in the game that doesn't have any status effect build-up. So unless you are specifically fighting enemies weak to lightning, that's about all this can do. Obviously, this was ridiculously overpowered and it was one-shotting enemies, but that was due to a bug that people were exploiting. Now that it is just a perfume bottle, it's the second worst of the lot, with the poison, chilling, and frenzy flame bottles all being far superior in their own specific situations. Next is the Horned Warrior's Greatsword. This is one of only 2 new curved greatswords in the DLC, and unfortunately I don't believe this is worth the investment, as there are far better options for this weapon category. Not only can you not get this weapon until very, very late on in the game, because it's a somber weapon, it cannot be infused with Ashes of War nor buffed with magic or consumables, and its Ash of War isn't anywhere near as good as it appears to be. The hitbox isn't anywhere near as far-reaching as it looks like it should be. And when you take that away, it's just an okay curved greatsword. Also, considering the fact that it also scales with Faith, despite the fact that it deals raw physical damage, the only thing the Faith scaling appears to do is buff the weapon skill. However, hold your horses as you're thinking about what alternative you should use in the curved greatsword category, because the next weapon up on my list is the only other curved greatsword in the DLC, Freya's Greatsword. Now, this ranks slightly higher than the Horned Warrior's Greatsword, despite the fact that if you look at the raw damage output of the weapon, unaltered, it is abysmal compared to the Horned Warrior's Greatsword. However, it is marginally better due to the fact that it can be buffed and infused. So you can make this weapon slightly better than the Horned Warrior's Greatsword, but that's all it's really got going for it. It does have a unique effect in which it enhances the power of Redmane battle skills, of which there are only 4. The Flame of the Redmanes, Flaming Strike, Lion's Claw, and Savage Lion's Claw. All of these are amazing skills in their own right. However, using this weapon simply to buff one of them slightly more isn't really worth it. They are absolutely incredible without needing this tiny little buff, and using this weapon purely for that is a bad idea. If you want a weapon in the Curved Greatsword category, fob off both these weapons and use something like the Bloodhound's Fang, because it's just incredible. Next is the Smith Script Dagger. I am heartbroken that I put this so low on the list, as it is the only weapon in the Throwing Blade category. Why they made a brand new category and only included one weapon in it is beyond me. And the fact that it's such a mediocre weapon breaks my heart. There are people out there desperately trying to make this work, and more power to them. I really hope someone can really make this work. But honestly, at best, you can make its damage okay. And even then, you're not taking into account its biggest flaw. And that's the fact that for a weapon that has purely ranged attacks in its moveset, its range is abysmal. Admittedly, you can make it longer with the ability Piercing Throw or with other Ashes of War, but if you just try and use its moveset, it barely reaches any further than the furthest reaching Pokey Spear in the game. I believe it is the shortest ranged weapon in the game. And for that reason, I'm sorry, but you are at spot number 15, my friend. As we move into the final 5 of the worst 20 weapons in the DLC, they are starting to get not too bad. Pretty much every weapon from here on out is viable in one way or another, but these still probably aren't ones you want to focus on until we at least get to the top half of the list. And this also marks the point in the video where we have finally encountered a weapon that I don't know how to pronounce, and I'm probably gonna fluff this up. So I'm assuming it's the main Gorsh? The main Ghost? No, I just sound like Goofy from Disney. Gorsh. The main Gorsh.
Gosh.
Anyway, this one. This, effectively, my friends, is a parry dagger. And it's okay, but that's just it. It's just okay. If you want to use this to parry, you are better off just using a small shield, as they have better, easier to use parry frames. And if you want to use this as a weapon, just use a dagger. There are so many better daggers out there. Obviously, one of the cool selling points is it can also be power stanced with a thrusting sword, and as you see here, in that situation, it can be pretty damn powerful. It's melting a few enemies here. But for the purposes of this list, we are rating these weapons with no crutches, no buffs, no additions to see how they stand on their own in comparison to other weapons. And when you strip it back, it's just a parry dagger, which is outclassed by literally any small shield. At number 17 is the Red Bear's Claw. Now, this weapon is actually pretty good, but there's one obvious reason that this is so low down on the list. This list is about making sure you don't waste your time, your energy, and your money on weapons that you don't need, and this is just a worse version of the Beast Claw. Yes, initially this does more damage, and yes, its Ash of War is actually pretty darn good, but that's where it ends. The matter of the fact is, if you buff and if you change the affinity on the Beast Claw, it will do more damage than the Red Bear's Claw. Then you take into account the fact that it's a regular smithing stone weapon, it can be infused, it can be buffed. There are so many ways in which you can make the Beast Claw far more powerful than the Red Bear's Claw. So the potential there is far, far higher. Plus, you get it way earlier on in the game, and you can put a bunch of brand new, really awesome Ashes of War on it. So for that reason, you don't want to waste your time and energy with the Red Bear's Claw when you have a better one, earlier and easier to obtain. Next up is the Dry Leaf Arts, and before I start to sound like a broken record, see Red Bear's Claw. This is literally just outclassed by Dane's footwork. Long story short, there is quite a lot of equipment that will enhance the power of kicks. However, there is no equipment specifically that will just benefit the Dry Leaf Arts. Things, for instance, like the Divine Bird Warrior Greaves are going to make Dane's footwork better, but they're not going to make Dry Leaf Arts better. So when you compare the two side by side, Dane's footwork just outclasses Dry Leaf Arts. Put simply, everything that can buff the Dry Leaf Arts hand-to-hand weapon can also buff Dane's footwork. However, many things that can buff Dane's footwork won't affect Dry Leaf Arts. So again, the damage potential for the Dry Leaf Arts is just lacking. Next up, another perfect comparison as to why this weapon is so low on the list, we are looking at the Parter. You only need to compare this to the Star Fists from the base game to see why this isn't a very good weapon. Yes, it has a cool gimmick in that when you are using it two-handed, it will use the straight sword moveset. However, if this is the primary reason you're using it, then just use a straight sword, because there are far better options. Then if you look at the fist moveset when you are dual wielding it, the Star Fist, as a similar example, is both lighter and more powerful, as well as having inherent blood loss buildup, whereas the Parter does not. So it's just the Star Fists, but worse. Do not bother with it. And rounding off the bottom 20 is, unfortunately, because I really love this weapon, the Flower Stone Gavel. Primarily, this weapon isn't really sure what it is. The Ash of War, along with dealing lightning damage, also temporarily reduces the target's lightning damage negation, and this can be charged to increase its power. Meaning, if you hit your target with this, and then with a bunch of lightning attacks, they're going to take more damage, which sounds great on the surface, right? And it's a pretty decent Ash of War. The only problem is, most lightning weapons scale with holy damage, not with arcane. And this weapon not only doesn't have any lightning damage on it, but also it scales primarily with arcane. And you may be saying to me, well that's fine, because quite a few dragon spells use both faith and arcane. Okay, great, so it's not totally redundant, but that doesn't change the fact that it still isn't really sure what it wants to be, and it tries to do too much, and fails in almost all areas. Another example is the fact that even when you use the Flower Dragon Bolt skill to affect an enemy with this reduced lightning damage negation, when you go up and hit with the same weapon that just applied that status effect, because it does raw physical damage, it has no bearing on your weapon attacks. The weapon that you just used to reduce the enemy's damage resistance then does not even benefit from the damage resistance. I'm sorry, Flower Stone Gavel, but you're just a bit weird, and there are far better hammers out there. Now that we've discussed the 20 worst weapons in the DLC, we're starting to get more into mediocrity now, but we still have some real stinkers to go first. Next up is the Barbed Staff Spear. I kind of now look back and wish I'd placed this even lower down on the list, because this really is not a very good weapon. As far as Great Spears go, it sucks in terms of its moveset and its damage output. But you'd think, being dropped by what's basically a main boss, that the Ash of War's got to have a redeeming quality, right? And this is actually going to be a really powerful weapon under the surface. And initially, Jory's Inquisition looks to be an incredibly cool Ash of War, as you thrust the Great Staff into the air, firing off a succession of golden barb-like arcs. Holding down the button extends the barrage for a short duration, for a total of 42 arcs launched. However, unfortunately, it does piss all damage. Due to hit detection, firstly, if you are firing at a single enemy, unless this is a bug that we don't know about, then many of your arcs won't register as hits. Only roughly 1 in every 3 or 4 will actually hit, because they're hitting in too quick of a succession. So really, for this to work, you need to be very, very quick on your right analog stick, spamming and switching between targets to make sure that as many arcs as possible are hitting. And even when that is the case, this deals abysmal damage. Don't forget, I am on a level 713 character here, with maxed out every single weapon. And this is near enough a Remembrance weapon, so for it to be this lackluster is absolutely unforgivable. Next is the Fire Knight's Short Sword, and despite the name, this is actually a dagger, and not a very good one at that. Yeah, it's really long for a dagger, which is quite cool, so it will fit into certain builds, which is why I haven't put it lower on the list. But honestly, there isn't much more to say than that. It's a bit longer than your average dagger, which makes it slightly better than most, but still not very good. Next up is the worst of all 3 of the new backhand blades. I am talking, unfortunately, about the rare drop, the Cursed Blades Cirque. Yes, its Ash of War looks very pretty, but it leaves you incredibly open to attacks. And considering you lose total control of your character and you leave yourself very, very open, it deals very little stagger or poise damage, and that makes it really unsafe to use against all but the smallest of enemies. So, does it make up for it with its bleed and its attack? No, not at all. Its blood loss build-up is very quickly trumped by either of the other backhand blades if you just stick bleed affinity on them, and its attack damage is the worst of the 3 by a long shot. And unlike the other Cirque, and despite how you see the Curse Blades using it, you can't even throw it. It's just a trash weapon. If you want to use a backhand blade, use the backhand blade. Or if you want to use a backhand blade that you can throw, use the Smith Script Cirque. Next up, we have got the Velvet Sword of Saint Trina. Now, when I review my footage, I actually kind of think I should have put this even lower down on the list. But I've got a soft spot for Saint Trina's lore, and I think it's a really cool weapon, so it took a higher spot than it deserves. Unfortunately, this is just a very subpar straight sword. You may be thinking, but Dom, it's got the new Eternal Sleep debuff. Surely this is amazing. No, it's absolute garbage. So if you didn't know, all Eternal Sleep does is it means that minor enemies will stay asleep permanently when afflicted by Eternal Sleep. Which, yes, sounds really cool because it means you can literally just punch them to death and they will not do anything. They will not wake up. However, this only works on the most minor enemies in the game. Even things like high-ranking soldiers and knights, not even bosses, just stronger minor enemies, still are unaffected by Eternal Sleep, and they just interact to falling asleep via Eternal Sleep in the same way that they would via regular sleep. So in a very niche situation, such as against the Godskin bosses, this is actually great, because you can effectively stun lock them to death. But aside from that one particular situation, this is just a bad straight sword with a really crap effect stuck on top of it. Unfortunately, that is literally all there is to this weapon, so that's why it is so low down on the list. And rounding off this 5 at number 25 is the Deadly Poison Perfume Bottle. Let's start with the upside. This is definitely one of the most effective ways to poison enemies in the game. It poisons very fast, and it actually inflicts deadly poison, which damages enemies far quicker than regular poison. However, at the end of the day, poison is still one of the worst status effects, because it still ticks up on your enemies very slowly, and more enemies are resistant to poison than the likes of Bleed or Scarlet Rot, both of which do tremendous amounts more damage than poison. And since the nerfs and since the bug fixes, the perfume bottles have just got a little bit lackluster, so it's no surprise that 3 of them have found their way into the bottom 25 weapons. However, don't worry, because the final 2 perfume bottles I haven't spoken about yet are actually really good and are far higher up on this list. At number 26 is the Great Sword of Damnation. Please stop me if I'm out of order saying this, but I feel like as this weapon is acquired by defeating the Lord of the Frenzied Flame, that his greatsword should maybe have madness build up? Why does it not? There is so much I really wanted to like about this weapon, but it just lets you down at every possible opportunity. Firstly, there are at least 5 holy greatswords in the game now. We did not need any more. And if you're going to put one in the game, at least make it a bit more unique and make it really worthwhile, especially as it's a Remembrance weapon from one of the coolest bosses in the DLC. Unfortunately, the damage isn't great, and neither is the scaling. How is this a Remembrance weapon with 2 Ds and a C? See, I was going to make a double D joke then, but I'm bigger than that, my friends, and I think that deserves a subscribe. Or maybe the fact that I didn't make the joke means I don't. Please subscribe. And to add to my list of ever-growing disappointments with this weapon, the Ash of War actually does incredible stance damage to enemies and can very easily poise break them. The only problem is the second hit animation takes so long that you cannot even capitalize on the critical strike opportunity, because most enemies have just got back up and carried on with their day again. Such a shame for what could have been an incredibly good weapon. Next up, another one that falls victim of the fact that there is just a straight up better version of it is the Dueling Shield. The Carian Thrusting Shield just outclasses this in pretty much every single category. Before you infuse or buff this or change the affinity in any way, it has slightly better physical damage than the Carian Thrusting Shield, but the scaling is worse, and it doesn't have any other elemental damage either. And when you add the magic damage of the Carian Thrusting Shield, the Dueling Shield just becomes terrible. And as I say, it's got a D in strength and a C in dex, whereas the Carian thrusting shield has a C in both of these stats and also scales off of your intelligence as well. So it's just straight up better than the dueling shield in pretty much every single category. If you want to use a thrusting shield, go with the Carian thrusting shield. It is really, really good. Weapon number 28 is the Blood Fiend's Sacred Spear. This is the absolute epitome of we have Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear at home. It has hundreds less attack power than Mohg's spear. Yes, its Ash of War is ranged, but it won't apply a buff like Mohg's does. It also has slightly higher base bleed build-up, but even then, it still gets outclassed when you consider the buff you get from Mohg's. I don't understand the need for this weapon. It's just Mohg's Sacred Spear, but worse. That's all there is to it. Next up at number 29 is the Shadow Sunflower Blossom. This will come as a surprise to a lot of people, but you have to consider the fact that we have so many colossal weapons in the game already, and they are all incredible. Something had to give. And when you compare this to a wholly infused Blood Fiend's Sacred Arm, it's pretty much the same weapon, just worse. The Blood Fiend's Sacred Arm is going to have 100 to 200 more attack rating, depending on your level and your stats. And then it's got that additional hidden bonus of having the blood stored within when executing a strong attack. Combine this with the fact that the Shadow Sunflower Headbutt realistically is a bit too slow to use in quicker, scarier fights. And you've got a weapon that is good, but just gets outclassed by far too many other weapons in its category that it doesn't really deserve a place higher up on the list, unfortunately. And rounding off the bottom 30, we have got the Death Knight's Twin Axes. Their attack rating is surprisingly good for a weapon that attacks this quick. However, for a somber weapon, the scaling is really bad with just 2 C's and a D, no B's, no A's, no S's. And the unique Ash of War Blink Bolt Twin Axe, what is that damage? Like, this is genuinely a really bad Ash of War. You're basically just using this weapon to R1 spam, and if you are going to R1 spam, there are far, far better weapons to do it with. Luckily for Death Knight enjoyers such as myself, we haven't looked at the Death Knight's Long Haft Axe yet, which is absolutely incredible in comparison. That will be coming up later on in the list. Now that we're getting into the 30s, the next few weapons are pretty decent situationally. And the middle of the list may get a bit murky because these are weapons that are okay if you tailor your build around them, but they're not amazing. And a perfect example of that is number 31, the Dragon Hunter's Great Katana. Obviously, against dragons, there isn't many better weapons in the game. This is absolutely crazy. Its weapon skill especially is so powerful, and it makes short work of most dragons and ancient dragons in the game. Unfortunately, this is where its awesomeness ends, which is why it isn't higher up on the list. If you compare everything else about this Great Katana to the other 2 Great Katanas, it's just a slightly worse version of both of them. Yes, its Ash of War is really cool because of the range that it has, but the stats on the Rakshasa Great Katana are better, and the Weed Cutter Ash of War that one has is really, really good. And the other Great Katana, being a smithing stone weapon, it can be infused, it can have its ashes changed, it can be buffed, so the other katanas are just straight up better than this one in most situations. Next up on the list is Tiolie's Hidden Needle. Unfortunately, this shares a very similar flaw to the new Velvet Sword of St. Trina. As far as fist weapons go, this isn't a particularly good one. And as far as status effects go, Eternal Sleep isn't a particularly good one either. If you desperately want to make this work, some people out there have made build guides on it and claim that it's pretty good. It's okay, but I don't think it's worth wasting your time, effort, and your precious upgrade materials on personally. Next up is the Messmer Soldier's Axe. At first, this seems like a pretty good weapon, considering how easily the Messmer soldiers that use it wreck your face. The charged heavy attack, especially the follow-up, because it does 2 additional attacks, is really, really good, especially at staggering enemies. But this is what we call a one-trick pony. That is all this axe has going for it. If you really desperately want to cosplay as a Messmer soldier, or if you adore its charged heavy attack, it's a pretty good weapon, you can use it. But if you value literally anything else in your weapons, go for a different axe. There are far better axes in the game. The next weapon, I was very surprised that I had to put this so far down the list, but hopefully you will understand when I explain. I am talking about the Euphoria. Unfortunately, the gimmick seems far stronger than it is. Let's first talk about the stats of the weapon, and then the reasons why its Ash of War actually sucks. Firstly, for a legendary weapon that you acquire right at the end of the game, its scaling really isn't very good, even when maxed out at plus 10. A double D and a B, that is terrible for a fully upgraded legendary somber weapon. And due to that, if you are looking at the raw damage output, there are other twin blades that are better. Even the brand new Black Steel Twin Blade, which you can get right near the start of the DLC. Now let's talk about Euphoria Vortex and the two reasons that this is actually not a very good Ash of War. Let me start by saying yes, if you fully charge Euphoria Vortex and use its full duration, it does a hell of a lot of damage. However, let's talk about in practice how impractical it is to actually do. Firstly, you need to hit targets 7 times within a 10-second window. And to fully charge it, you need to do that again. So 14 times in roughly a 15 to 20 second window. That's a lot of hits. And yes, the same hit on multiple enemies in a sweeping motion will apply multiple charges, but in reality, to hit that much on any big target, which isn't going to stagger very easily, you are leaving yourself open to many counterattacks, and you're giving up so much survivability just to try and charge your Ash of War, which is very risky, and 9 times out of 10 will leave you bashed in the face and on your ass. And this is where we come to the other problem with this weapon. It is primarily holy damage based, and what enemies in the game are particularly susceptible to holy damage? That's right, those who live in death. We are talking skeletons, other undead beings, death birds, deathrite birds. There are many undead enemies in the game, even the undead beastmen of Farum Azula. This weapon does not charge its Ash of War when fighting against the undead. So the enemies that this weapon is most effective against, it is least effective against. How incredibly counterintuitive is that? Long story short, it's a really great weapon idea, executed abysmally. Next is the Sword of Night. Initially, you may think, actually, this is a pretty good weapon. Witching Hour Slash particularly is an awesome Ash of War. What are you talking about, Dom? This is a really good weapon. And for PvP, yeah, maybe. Especially because you cannot completely guard against its attacks because the blade of the sword is semi-corporeal, and the Ash of War even more so. This literally cannot be blocked. So, great for PvP, but we're talking about general everyday use here. And if you strip that back, it's just a mediocre katana with single attribute scaling, which is very bad. And it is our third katana with a physical magic damage split. And if that's what you're going for, either stick with the Moonveil from the base game or upgrade to the Star-Lined Sword, which is actually a really good weapon and will be featuring on this list later. Starting off the final 5 weapons in the bottom half of this tier list, before we finally start to look at the actually good weapons, is the Poisoned Hand. This weapon, along with the Maddening Hand, I feel really should have been hand-to-hand weapons. Unfortunately, they're both fist weapons. To put that in perspective, we got 5 new fist weapons in the DLC and only 2 hand-to-hand, with 2 of the fist weapons literally being called the Poisoned Hand and the Maddening Hand. And yes, it's cool that this weapon does have inherent poison buildup and it's got a unique Ash of War, but the Ash of War isn't great and neither is the weapon. This pretty much purely scales with Arcane, and due to the fact that it essentially has a single attribute scaling because its strength scaling is abysmal, it means the damage output isn't very good. And does it make up for this by how effectively it inflicts poison? No, not really. There are far better options out there, such as the hand-to-hand weapons or even the Maddening Hand. Next up, we've got the Spirit Glaive. As a halberd, probably its closest comparison is Loretta's War Sickle, which just outclasses this in every single aspect. Compared to Loretta's War Sickle, the damage on the Spirit Glaive is absolutely atrocious, and it unfortunately doesn't make up for this with its Rancor / Ash of War. The actual slash itself does a decent amount of damage, but without heavily tailoring your build specifically around the Rancor spirits that are summoned when using it, they themselves do abysmal damage. As you know, every single thing on this character is maxed out. I'm only on New Game +1, and it's not even taking out any of the minor enemies in this cave. It's better than some halberds, and the Ash of War at the very least is cool and can be tailored to certain builds, which is why it's not lower down on the list, but it definitely didn't deserve a spot in the top half. Next up at number 38 is the Smith Script Cirque. Though it is much better than the other Cirque, it just narrowly misses out on being the best backhand blade. That spot is taken by the aptly named Backhand Blade. Don't get me wrong, this isn't a bad weapon, and the fact that the heavy attack will throw it makes it even cooler. It does have some utility there. However, now that we're halfway through the list, we need to cull all weapons that aren't the best in their category, and the Backhand Blade is simply a better weapon, and I will talk about why when we come to it later on in the list. Another example of this is the next weapon on this list, Queline's Greatsword. Don't let the name of this weapon confuse you, it isn't a greatsword, it's actually a heavy thrusting sword, and it is by no means a bad weapon, but there are better weapons in the category. It's pretty much smack bang in the middle of the list for a reason. If you really want to make this work, you can, and it is cool that it's the only faith scaling heavy thrusting sword in the game with inherent fire damage. However, the other thrusting swords that can have their affinities changed can be better than this. There's not really anything more to say on this weapon. It isn't bad, but it isn't great. So that's why it goes right in the middle of the list. And also, I should say, the only other heavy thrusting sword in the DLC, Sword Lance, this can be an incredible weapon, and it will be coming up later. And finally, just narrowly missing out on the category of weapons that could be considered good, right at the very top of the bottom, number 40 is the Swift Spear, which initially looks like a really bad spear, because in regards to its actual attack rating and how much damage output it gives, it is particularly low in comparison to other weapons of its category. However, the moveset and the speed of this spear in comparison to all other spears make it almost a good weapon. If you apply the right weapon buffs and you infuse this with statuses, it becomes very, very quick and very, very effective at applying statuses and racking up that damage. This is particularly good when put in your offhand and paired with another weapon, and can fit into quite a few builds. It is a genuinely decent weapon, but it just misses out on being in the top half of the list, as there are so many actually impressive weapons in this DLC. As we're approaching the halfway point in the list, we have finally covered all of the below average weapons. So from this point on, almost every weapon I'll be sharing with you is viable in one way or another. We're still in the average section at the moment, but they're just going to be getting better and better from here on out, so they are pretty much all worth your consideration. And one quick question for you before we move on. Have you noticed the theme throughout this video, specifically with the enemies and bosses that I've been killing? I'll reveal this a bit later on, but I'm curious if anyone has picked up on what I've been doing, so let me know in the comments. The next weapon I'm going to talk about is Moonrithil's Night Sword. And let me start by showing you both of these swords. Can you tell which is which? One of them is the Moonrithil Night Sword, and one of them isn't. In fact, if we look in the inventory here, you can see that the other one is actually the Troll Knight's sword. And have you noticed that apart from the Ash of War, they are both identical in every single way? That is exactly why this weapon is so low down on the list. In its own right, it's a pretty good weapon, but it's literally just a copy-paste of a weapon that already exists, with a bit of a better Ash of War stuck on top of it. The Ash of War admittedly is really cool and can be very powerful situationally, which is why this copy-pasted sword isn't lower down on the list. And even though this is quite a strong sword, especially if you tailor your build to it, because it's literally just a copy pasta, I couldn't bring myself to rate this any higher than absolutely smack bang in the middle of the list. Next up, we've got the Smith Script Spear, which definitely is one of the less powerful weapons on the list. However, as I said, all of the weapons in the top half are viable in one way or another, and this spear really shines on horseback. It's absolutely great to use in the open world. If you didn't know, the heavy attack both on and off your horse will throw the spear, and it will throw it with incredible accuracy. You can even throw this while you're mid-air with Torrent, so you can hide behind something, you can jump up and then fall to the ground again to continue hiding. There is a lot of really fun things you can do with the ability to throw the Smith Script Spear. As I say, it's definitely not the most powerful in the world, but as it can have its affinity and Ash of War changed, you can do some pretty good things with it. Especially on Torrent, it is deadly accurate and rarely misses its mark, which makes it excellent against some of the really annoying enemies you may encounter in the open world. Next up is the Gazing Finger, which is actually most comparable to the Sacred Relic Sword. This sounds really weird at first, as one is a great sword and one is a great hammer, but its Ash of War does effectively the same thing, releasing this giant wave of damage after a short delay. The Sacred Relic Sword does more damage and has a further reach. However, the Gazing Finger is incredible because it's strike damage. And of all the 4 main damage types, Standard, Pierce, Slash, and Strike, Strike is by far the best, because there are certain enemies in the game that are resistant to all forms of damage apart from Strike. However, there are very few enemies that are resistant to Strike damage. So for the most part, you will be dealing full damage to all targets whilst using a strike weapon. The main reason it's not higher up on the list is because the scaling is a little bit too split for a really well-defined and tailored build. As you can see, it does physical and magic damage, which scales off of strength and int. However, the weapon skill, which is by far the most powerful part of the weapon, deals holy damage and scales off of faith. So it's a little bit all over the place, and you need to be a very high level to effectively use this weapon, which is why even though it's good, it has its drawbacks and it hasn't made it higher up the list. Next up, we've got the Obsidian Lamina. Its Ash of War dynastic sickle play is absolutely amazing. It makes you feel like a total badass when you avoid an enemy's attack with its first jump back, and then you lunge forward to deal thousands of damage. Very cool weapon. As far as Reapers go, it may well be the best, perhaps just behind the Halo Scythe because of how good the Ash of War is on that thing. Its blood loss build-up isn't bad, it's overall an above-average weapon, hence why it has found its way to this place on my list. The main reasons it isn't higher, however, firstly, you do not get this until the very end of the game. I'm talking after you have beaten the final boss. And secondly, it does have a very high-risk, high-reward playstyle, because if you want to use the full Ash of War, you are leaving yourself open to many attacks from enemies who aren't easily staggered. Next up is the Madding Hand, which I believe I referred to as the Maddening Hand earlier. I swear Maddening Hand sounds so much better, but it is in fact the Madding Hand. I wanted to adore this weapon. Fist weapons are so strong, madness build-up is so strong, and its stats and its damage are really good. The only problem is how damn hard the Ash of War is to use. This thing has such a short range and such a long build-up that you end up just having to use this as a standard fist weapon that happens to have madness build-up. Now, for your madness-focused build, that could be great, but is having madness enough to put this in the top of the list when everything else about the weapon is subpar? Probably not, unfortunately. There are far better options. See also the Frenzy Flame perfume bottle, which we will be discussing later. However, as you can see against this putrid avatar, if you are literally just using it as a charged heavy attack weapon, it's great, but then again, so are the Starfists. In fact, they're even better if this is the sole purpose you are using this weapon. And talking of perfume bottles, the next weapon on this list, and the second best perfume bottle in the game, is the Chilling perfume bottle. At high levels, both character level and upgrade level, the Chilling perfume bottle can have the highest attack rating of all the perfume bottles, and then it also causes frostbite, which is an incredibly powerful status effect because so few enemies in the game are resistant to it, and it increases the damage done by all other forms of damage. So really solid in so many aspects. And if you do like perfume bottles and you happen to be fighting enemies that are resistant to fire, then this is your best option. This is the best perfume bottle after the Frenzy Flame. So as I say, for enemies that are fire resistant, this is the best bet. If you are spec'd into it correctly, it can deal thousands of damage. The unique Ash of War is really fun, really cool, and Frostbite is just such a great status effect. Next up, we have got the Claws of Night. Their Ash of War Scattershot Throw is insanely good at causing bleed build-up on enemies. They are a fantastic option for enemies that are quite weak to bleed, especially because of the insane range that Scattershot Throw has on it. If your primary purpose is bleeding your target, they are fantastic. Unfortunately, as with many weapons in the middle of my list, they are a one-trick pony. They don't do anything else particularly well. There are better claws, which is already a pretty lackluster weapon type, and if you are fighting enemies that can't bleed, they are then absolute garbage. For a weapon to earn a higher spot on my list, it needs to be good in many situations, and this is only good in one specific situation. Next up, we've got the Sword of Darkness. You get this from transforming the stone-sheathed sword at one of the 3 altar locations in the DLC. Think of it as the Eevee of Elden Ring. And of the 2 evolutions, unfortunately, Dark just isn't quite as good as Light for one main reason. The wind-up on its Ash of War is far too long to be used in any real-world situation. You'll see later on in the list, the Sword of Light Ash of War is far, far better. Both of these swords are pretty cool, but it wouldn't make sense putting them both high up on the list when one is clearly far better than the other. As you can see, it is so hard to actually use Darkness without getting instantly punished by your enemies. It takes so long to cast. However, it's still a really cool sword, and it's still a pretty good straight sword. So if straight swords are your thing, it's definitely not a bad option. Ideally, what will be incredible is get to New Game Plus and run both the Sword of Dark in one hand and the Sword of Light in the other, because one will increase the damage your holy attacks do, and the other will increase the damage that your enemies take from holy attacks. So both of these swords in tandem would be really cool, plus the dual-wielding straight sword moveset is very awesome. So that's a way to make this sword a bit more than just above average. Next up is the polearm of the Bud. This is Romina's boss weapon. Another incredibly good weapon in theory. The Ash of War looks amazing, it does loads of damage, the weapon itself has inherent Scarlet Rot buildup, which so few weapons in the game have. Overall, it's a pretty strong halberd. Again though, for 2 main reasons, this is just above average. Firstly, it's a one-trick pony. If you cannot rot your enemy, it becomes quite an average halberd. And secondly, the Ash of War, Romina's Purification, takes ages to use and leaves you so open to being countered. This weapon, again, like the Obsidian Lamina, is just a bit too high risk to use in most late game situations. And really, you would just use it for the gimmick because it looks damn cool rather than for efficiency. At this point in the list, we are now into the top 29 weapons in the whole of the DLC, and my god did it start getting hard to number and order these, because they all start to become really strong. We have a couple more coming up here that are kind of only strong in a few situations, but as of about weapon number 55, they all get amazingly powerful. And the end of the list is going to become a very close call as to which few I deem worthy of the top 10. Next up is surprisingly a fairly common drop and not a special weapon in any regard. We are talking about the Mesmer Soldier's Spear. You may think, how have you put a basic ass soldier's weapon ahead of a few Remembrance weapons? My friends, this weapon is very unique in one certain regard, and that is its charged heavy attack. It shares this with only one other weapon in the game, being the Tree Spear. What is so unique about this charged heavy attack is it will unleash 2 quick consecutive attacks, which means that this weapon not only does more DPS than most great spears, but is fantastic at applying status effect buildups. So if you apply something like bleed or poison to this, it's going to be way more effective at applying that stat than most other great spears. And then you add on top of that the fact that this is one of only 3 spears in the game with a standard pierce damage split. Most great spears are pure pierce, as you would imagine, which makes them incredibly bad against heavily armored enemies, enemies made out of crystal, enemies made out of rock or stone, anything like that. However, the Mesmer Soldier Spear nullifies some of this by having standard damage in the mix as well. Overall, it's very versatile and surprisingly powerful for how insignificant this initially seems. Next up, we've got the Sword of Light. This, unfortunately, is only a few spaces up the list from the Sword of Darkness. It is better because its Ash of War is easier to use, but it trades the ease of use for damage. and it really doesn't do all that much damage unless you are targeting huge enemies with massive hitboxes. Yes, at max level, it's managing to do nearly 2000 damage against some of these knights when almost every single beam hits, but the length of time that it takes to do this, other higher up weapons on the list can do this amount of damage in just one swing. It's a very cool gimmick, and as I said earlier, paired with the Sword of Darkness, could make something seemingly powerful, but by themselves, they're an okay, above average straight sword. At number 52 is the Sword Lance. The flavor text states that this armament shows its true potential when used astride a mount. I disagree with this. I feel like this shows its true potential when you apply some kind of status build up to it. For how quick this heavy thrusting sword attacks, the amount of poison, bleed, or frost buildup this can do is absolutely insane. If you apply something like blood tax or repeating thrusts on it, this can easily bleed an enemy in just one combo, as it's dealing nearly 200 bleed per hit. This is genuinely one of the best status effect build-up weapons in the whole game. Of course, it is fun to use on horseback because you use it more like a lance than a heavy thrusting sword, and it's just genuinely a really cool, really unique weapon. It has a lot going for it. And if you really want to make it work, then you very much can. And next up, tied with this weapon, I have put it one slot higher, but I'm now thinking that they're very much on par with each other, is the Black Steel Twin Blade. As far as Twin Blades go, it's got the most DPS in the game. At base level, it has like one less DPS than the Gargoyle's Twin Blade, but its scaling is much, much better. And due to the fact that this can be infused and it can be buffed, you can make some really disgusting builds with this. If Twin Blades are your thing, this is a great, great option. I've never really been very good with Twin Blades. I suck with it, so it was hard putting it this high up on the list, but I had to look at all these weapons objectively, and objectively speaking, if you are proficient with Twin Blades, if you are a Twin Blade user, this is an incredible option for you, especially if you put on something like Black Flame Tornado, so it can melt massive, massive targets as well, like this Stone Golem. Next up, Death Knight enjoyers rejoice because we now have finally come to the Death Knight's Long-Haft Axe. Honestly, I considered putting this even higher up the list. It is a genuinely incredible weapon. But from this point on, the last 24 weapons or so are all incredible, so it was really hard to differentiate between the next few. Either way, genuinely amazing weapon. I love its unique Ash of War. It does actually make you go invisible, very similarly to the Bloodhound's Fang, which means you are immune to attacks. It's like a really, really long dodge roll where you have iframes, you're completely invisible, you cannot be hit. And then add on top of that the fact that this is one of the few genuinely good lightning weapons in the game. Lightning is a really, really powerful damage type because so few enemies are resistant to it, and it's very underutilized as well. Most good weapons that you see are either holy or fire, so it's amazing to have a really good lightning weapon. When you follow up and do the big slam with the weapon skill, not only does it do loads of damage, but it does loads of stagger as well. It's a really fun weapon to use, really good looking, just generally an overall solid lightning great axe. And if that's your thing, this is probably the best option out there for you. We're into the top 25 weapons in the whole entire game now, my friends. So from here on out, pretty much every single one is going to be an absolute banger in its own right. But before I reveal the 25th position on this list, did you know that the Dom's Roundtable channel also has a Patreon? And if you do go and support the channel by signing up over there, you can unlock various exclusive benefits, such as early access to all of my upcoming videos, exclusive merchandise, and even a private Discord channel with me in my Discord server, where a few of us regularly chat about pretty much whatever you want to. So go check out my Patreon at patreon.com/DomsRoundtable and jump into my Discord server whilst you're at it and say hey. Anyway, enough stalling. Number 55 on this list is the Frenzy Flame Perfume Bottle. This is hands down the best perfume bottle because it does loads of damage and also it has that very coveted Madness status effect builder. It is hard to get a decent Madness weapon in this game, and here we have finally found one. There's not much more to say about it that I haven't already covered in the other perfume bottles in this list. It basically just does what they do, but better. It's really, really good. Next up is Dane's footwork. As I mentioned earlier when talking about the Tri-Leaf arts, again, this just does what that does, but so much better. And for anyone that missed it because you've just skipped to the end of the video to see what's the top 20, no judgment, that's fine. But I do strongly advise you go back and check out the other items on this list as well, because I will be talking about these last few, assuming you already know what I've said about their counterparts previously. But anyway, as I said previously, Dane's footwork is so much better than Dryleaf Arts because there are so many items in this game that will enhance the ability of your kicks. However, not really anything that enhances the ability of punches. Therefore, Dane's footwork has so much equipment that synergizes with it to make it even better than it already is. Just two examples are the Shattered Stone Talisman and also the Horned Bird Warrior Greaves. As you can see, it's just a genuinely amazing weapon with a really cool moveset. Honestly, the only negative for me is that there isn't more hand-to-hand weapons in the game. Next up, we have got Devonia's Hammer. As far as the new colossal weapons go, at higher levels this has the most physical damage of all new colossal weapons, which makes this a really strong Binky Bonk hammer, really good for your Unga Bunga build. However, unfortunately, that's kind of where the good things about this weapon stop. Yes, Devonia's Hammer is great stat-wise, it's got pretty good scaling, and it's got pretty good attack rating. Not the best, but definitely above average. However, now we talk about the Ash of War, Devonia's Vortex. This is a very, very slow Ash of War, and you can only make the most of this if you fully charge it, and most enemies will not allow you to do that. It takes forever. And you know how much I disapprove of copy-pasted weapons from the base game. And unfortunately, not only is the Ash of War essentially a copy-paste of the Ordovis Greatsword, but listen to this. It weighs twice as much, it does less stance damage, and it does less damage. So if you are primarily using this for the Ash of War, the Ordovis Greatsword is literally just a better weapon in every single way. This is a decent colossal weapon, however, if you're using it primarily for the attacks, there are better colossal weapons, and if you're using it primarily for the Ash of War, use Ordovis's Greatsword, it's far better. Next up is the Greatsword of Radahn Light. This, unfortunately, is nowhere near as good as the Lord version. In both stats and attack, they are identical. So the only two things you have to compare really are the Ash of War, and the Ash of War on the Lord equivalent is just so much better that it is significantly higher up the list than this weapon. However, even if you remove that, you have to admit that Radahn's Greatswords are just incredibly powerful weapons. The moveset's great, the fact that it splits into two, even just using the one, opens up so many opportunities and options for your build. It's just an all-round really solid weapon. Next up, just above this, is the Greatsword of Solitude. Weirdly, this is a greatsword that says it's a greatsword that is actually a greatsword. There are so many weapons in this game that have the name of one weapon but are something completely different, such as the Greatsword of Radahn, that's actually a colossal sword. However, this greatsword is a greatsword. And why do I keep banging on about this? Why is this so good? It's because greatswords have a much faster moveset. And as a category of weapons, they are really, really good. Unfortunately, most of the good ones are all holy swords. So it's incredible to finally have some variety and have a pure physical damage version that is also a really solid greatsword. As for its Ash of War, the initial vertical arc of light is very similar to the Ash of War vacuum slice. However, unfortunately, it does have slightly shorter range and slightly less stance damage. However, the thing that makes this better is the follow-up lunging horizontal swipe, which also does a load more stance damage, looks very cool, covers a wide area, and because it's a big horizontal swipe, this can be used against multiple targets as well, making this a really versatile weapon and a great addition to the greatsword category. We are now finally moving into the top 20 weapons in the entire game, and if you have made it this far, my friends, let me first say thank you so much for watching such a long, in-depth video. I cannot stress how long this video has taken to put together, and every time I thought I was finally happy with my order, I would revisit another weapon and think, actually, this is way better than I first thought. Actually, this is really niche, this is not as good as I thought, and I had to change this list so many times before I was happy and comfortable with the ordering of every weapon on this list. So for anyone who has genuinely made it this far and hasn't just skipped to the final 20, thank you so much. And if that doesn't deserve a subscription to my channel, then I don't know what does. So please go ahead and click that sub button, give this video a like, and leave me a comment letting me know that you have watched this entire video, because you are an incredible person, and thank you so much for your support. Anyway, without further ado, let's finally get into the top 20 weapons in the entirety of Shadow of the Erdtree, starting off with Lady Leda's sword. In regards to damage and scaling, this is the worst light great sword, and you may crucify me for putting this at 20th, because if you just look at the stats, there are many weapons lower on this list that are better than this sword, but you need to appreciate the strength of the new light greatsword category. All three of the new light greatswords were always going to make it into the top 20 because they are just so powerful in so many different situations and scenarios. I would be here waffling on about this weapon for so long if I was to list them all out, but the move set and the fact that you can chain light and heavy attacks together makes this lethal in PvP because it is so hard to telegraph. And in PvE, it's just a great move set that can counter so many different enemies. Then on top of that, you have the Needle Piercer, which is an absolute game ender for so many enemies, both NPC and players alike. It is almost unfair how good this is at roll catching and interrupting buffers in PvP. This can be such a sweaty weapon, and that's just one of the reasons it's earned its spot in the top 20. Alongside that, the Needle Piercer Ash of War does a split between holy and physical damage, just like the weapon's normal attacks, which is fantastic because it means if you are fighting holy resistant enemies, this is still going to be worthwhile and the damage isn't going to suddenly plummet. Also, this benefits from so many different buffs. To name just a few, you've got the Blue Dancer Charm, Flame Grant Me Strength, Exalted Flesh, and Golden Vow. Hugely increase the damage of this Ash of War because of the fact it shoots 10 different projectiles at your enemy. This can seriously melt the health of so many enemies, from a decent range may I add as well. The worst of the three light greatswords, but still a really good weapon. Next up at number 19, that's right, I'm going to start counting down now until we get to number 1 as we are in the top 20. Next up is the Beast Claw. I was initially going to put this far further down on the list than I have. I'm surprised at myself that this is nearly in the top 20. The main reason I was going to mark it down is I need to consider all aspects when making this list. And unfortunately for the Beast Claws, they are a very tough moveset to use. And because one single press of the light attack will string you into a combo of 2 to 4 moves, it can leave you vulnerable and open to attacks if you're not staggering your enemies. However, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that everyone watching is an absolute pro player at Elden Ring, because I know you are, my friends. I know you are. Deep down, even if you don't believe it, I do. And if you truly get good at using the Beast Claw's moveset, it's so powerful. Along with this specific Ash of War that I used to wreck the Mad Pumpkinhead duo, there is just so much to love about this weapon. It's really versatile, it's great in PvP, the moveset's crazy, the damage is awesome, it's just such a solid weapon. Next up we have got the Horned Warrior's Sword. This is probably quite a surprise for most people. At its core, it's just a decent curved sword. However, the Ash of War has so much potential, especially in PvP, if you get good at aiming it. If you didn't know, you can free aim the Ash of War. And when you get used to this, it's very intuitive and you can reach really far with it, meaning it will be very hard for your enemy to roll out the way of this. Also, fun fact, I don't have footage of this unfortunately, but because if you two-hand it, you actually dual-wield it, if you use both of these, it then looks like you've got 4 swords equipped, 2 sheathed and 2 unsheathed, and I don't know, that's just really cool to me. But this is a great looking sword, it's got really decent stats and attack rating considering the low requirements that it needs, which means this is fantastic for low-level builds. And despite the fact that it scales better with strength and dexterity, you mainly want to use this because horn calling, its Ash of War, is so fucking good. And that scales purely with faith. So you could even use this in your pure spellcaster incantation build, and it would be absolutely devastating. At number 17 is the Falx. This is another new paired curved sword, so works exactly the same way as the Horned Warrior's sword, and even though the bleed build-up on this doesn't seem amazing at first, when you combine it with the Ash of War, it will bleed enemies so insanely quickly. If only this wasn't a somber weapon and there was a way to increase the bleed scaling. If you use other pieces of equipment, such as potentially offhanding with a Blood Bandit curve sword with seppuku, and basically just make your bleed scaling as insane as you can, because already this weapon has really good attack power, but there's no way to inherently boost the blood loss buildup. So if you build around this, you can make such an insanely fast bleed build. It is a very slept on weapon and really, really powerful in the right hands. And finally, rounding off the bottom quarter of the top 20, we have got the Anvil Hammer. This weapon is really, really good for people who have high level builds. The scaling on this weapon is off the charts. It's far better than it appears. It looks like it virtually has an S rank in every category that it scales with. Obviously that's not what it says on paper, but you can get this thing to over 1200 attack rating, which is around 200 more than its closest rival, the Giant Crusher. Apart from these two, pretty much every single other weapon in the game has less than 1000 attack rating, even when infused with Flame Art or Sacred, which tend to be the most powerful two infusions. Then the Anvil Hammer comes along and has around 1200 at high level stats. This thing hits like an absolute truck. And then you've got its weapon skill as well, the Smithing Art Spears, which not only hits twice, but deals loads of stagger damage and deals an absolute ton of actual damage as well. If you have a very high poise build and you just spam this with plenty of other equipment boosting your attack rating, you can deal 3,000 or 4,000 damage in the base game with one hit. Nearly 10k per hit in the DLC with this weapon. It is absolutely devastating when used to its maximum potential. 5 more weapons to go, my friends, until we are in the top 10. For everyone who stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching this whole video. I really hope it's been both enjoyable and educational. And now at number 15, we have Rakshasa's Great Katana. This is a very powerful weapon. Great Katanas have an amazing moveset and some fantastic stats. It has inherent bleed build-up, and its Ash of War is really fun and very spammable. There is very little to not like about this weapon. The only reason it's not the highest Great Katana on this list is because it's a bit more high risk, high reward than the standard Great Katana, because it does reduce all your damage negation by 10% when attacking. So you are basically going to take 10% more damage from all sources. The trade-off for this is that whilst you are attacking, you are less likely to stagger, so you can spam that Ash of War even more frequently. And as Great Katanas have really good stance damage, it means you are also going to be staggering your enemies quite frequently. And it's for that reason that this weapon has made it so high up the list. It's very spammable, and on really tanky builds where you've got loads of health and loads of survivability, you can dish out so much damage by just spamming the Weed Cutter again and again and again. Rakshasa's Great Katana, really solid weapon all around. Next up at number 14 is the Smith Script Great Hammer. I started working on this video weeks ago. This has taken ages because I've had to fully test all 80 melee weapons in the whole entire DLC, and unfortunately since starting this, the Smith Script Great Hammer has been nerfed along with all other Smith Script weapons. Luckily I have been able to change the weapons to reflect this. I did have it in my top 10 before because it's got such a unique moveset and it's really, really great still in so many situations. Unfortunately now it just does a lot less damage than it did before. Before the nerf and with the right equipment, you could easily get 1500, maybe even 2000 with the right build with a fully charged strong attack. Now it's hard to even push 1000 really. But it's still really, really good situationally, And the fact that dashing strong attacks will also throw the hammer as well is amazing for kiting enemies and staying on the move whilst you're attacking. It's such a versatile moveset, and because of the fact that this can be infused with Ashes of War, it can fit into so many different builds, and effectively now your big, strong melee build has a ranged projectile for 0 FP cost. It's all round still a really solid weapon, just not quite as good as it was before. Next up at number 13 is the Putrescence Cleaver. What is not to like about this weapon? It's a very strong great axe with inherent frost buildup and a really powerful, really staggerable Ash of War. The only negative for me, in a similar vein to Rakshasa's Great Katana, is though you can spam the Ash of War again and again, it does leave you vulnerable to counterattacks. And even when you want to stop the Ash of War, you have to finish your current animation, which can take a while. So until you really get to learn the moveset, you are naturally going to take a lot more hits than you ordinarily would, just from learning the moveset and learning the length of the animation when you stop spamming the Ash of War. That being said though, the fact that this is an inherent frostbite weapon, the fact that it's such a powerful great axe, and that the spinning guillotine is so powerful, along with the heavy jumping attack you can tag onto the end of it as well, it's so versatile and you can use this to stun lock and stagger enemies so fast. This is definitely not only one of the best, but one of the most fun weapons in the game. And at the end of the day, fun is the name of the game. That's exactly why we all play video games. And efficiency is all well and good, but if you don't enjoy the weapon, then it's just not going to be as good. And the Putrescence Cleaver looks so damn cool, feels really cool to use, and shout out to one of my favourite games of all time. This is effectively the weapon that the Orphan of Kos uses right at the end of the Bloodborne DLC. My favourite DLC of all time, the Old Hunters. My god, do I pray this gets a remake. And using this weapon and spinning around like the Orphan of Kos just makes me want to go and play Bloodborne. As you can tell, I've got a real sweet spot for Bloodborne, and therefore a real sweet spot for this weapon, which probably hasn't helped me be particularly unbiased, but it does still definitely deserve its spot in the top 15. Next up is the Star-Lined Sword. I love a katana, who doesn't? And this one is tied to some of my favourite lore in the game. The Swordmaster Onza and his disciples. I really want to know so much about these guys. This is one of their swords, as evidenced by the Ash of War, Onza's line of stars. The more you use this Ash of War, the more powerful it gets, with the final hit where you go invisible and teleport into the sky, dealing thousands of damage. And this skill scales with the weapon's attack rating and gets boosted by all multi-hit talismans and the Thorny Cracked tier. So if you build your character specifically around this katana, its Ash of War can do crazy amounts of damage. Bearing in mind this whole video I've been using no enhancement boosting equipment, no talismans, no buffs, so what you're seeing is its real base level damage at the moment. This thing can go crazy. And also, as with I think all katanas in the game, it has inherent blood loss buildup, which is always amazing because so many enemies are susceptible to bleed, and that means it's even better against late game bosses. Honestly, there's nothing not to love about this weapon. Katanas have got a really cool moveset, really good feel to them, and the Ash of War of this weapon is absolutely top tier. I very nearly put it in the top 10. From this point on, for the next like 8 weapons or so, it was really hard getting the ordering because they are all just so insanely good. And the next weapon just barely missing out on the top 10 is R'Lana's Twin Blades. This is another paired weapon, meaning you only need one copy in order to dual wield it. Quite a few of these in the DLC, and I do enjoy them, so it's much appreciated. And what more is there really to say about this weapon than just how unnecessarily hard it goes? It's really fun to use. I just really wish there were more stance Ashes of War in the DLC than just this and wing stance, because it's such a cool new mechanic that they even built a brand new talisman around it, and then you can literally only use it with this weapon or wing stance. However, that aside, this is good enough for a brand new talisman. Moon and Fire stance is just so incredibly awesome. And fun fact about Rellana's twin blades that I didn't even find out until after I had finished recording everything for this video, the main sword used if you are only using one of them differs depending on which hand it is being held in. So if you've got it in your left hand, it will always be the Fire Faith scaling blade, and if you've got it in your right hand, it will always be the Magic Int scaling blade. That is such a cool little feature for me. And it means this can be paired and dual wielded with the Milady, appropriately infused to fit basically any build that you want. If you want to go pure int or pure faith and still get the most out of these twin blades, you can literally do that by pairing it in the correct hand with the Milady. How awesome is that to know? There are many more things I want to say about this weapon, but they can apply to all light greatswords, so I'll save the rest of my rant for when we talk about the Milady in the top 10 later on in the video. And just quickly before we move into the top 10 and find out what weapon is at number 10, I wanted to once again thank everyone for watching such a long video. This took countless hours to put together. I really hope it's appreciated. I had a lot of fun making it, but my God, has it been hard work. If my efforts are appreciated, don't forget YouTube now has the super thanks feature, meaning those of you who would like to show your support can opt to send me a super thanks. This is a one-off donation to show your appreciation for your favorite content creators, and it's also a great way of getting your comment read and guaranteeing a response from me. And for anyone who does decide I'm worthy of this kind of above and beyond support, please know you are absolutely amazing. I truly appreciate you for supporting the channel and supporting my content. Now, let's get into the top 10. Next up is the Great Katana. Named after the weapon type that it is, the Great Katana is the only of the 3 Great Katanas that is upgraded with smithing stones and can be buffed and infused, making this such a deadly combo for basically any build in the game. Because of the amount of customization options and because of its base scaling, this can fit in pretty much every build in the game. I adore using this with poison affinity with the flower blooms twice because it gives it bleed, poison, and rot. So you can quickly proc the poison and then use that with the Ash of War to use up the poison and deal a big burst amount of damage, hopefully then applying the rot. You can then leave the rot on and switch back to using regular attacks to reapply poison and apply bleed. If that doesn't sound ridiculously overpowered to you, I don't know what is. Also, the Great Katana weapon type has an amazing moveset. This is just an all-round top-tier weapon, well worthy of going in your arsenal. The second weapon in the top 10 is the Black Steel Great Hammer. You probably already know exactly how much I love this weapon, considering it was the very first build guide I created, and I bang on about it pretty much every other video. This has a unique guard counter which releases a trail of gold on the ground, dealing additional bonus holy damage a second after the initial hit, meaning this weapon is perfect for big tanky builds. I won't go on about the details and the specifics too much because this video is already well over an hour and a half long, probably even 2 hours by the end. So if you do want to know the details and the specifics of exactly how strong this can be, go and watch my build guide. You can see me almost no-hitting the Dancing Lion first try. It is truly an absolutely terrifying weapon. And also because it can be enchanted with magic, because it can be boosted by consumables, and because it can be infused with Ashes of War and have its affinity change, this can fit into practically every single build that you want, making it really versatile and really powerful. Also, please note the Flame Art infusion is definitely the best way to go, because as the weapon states, as it is blessed with an Erdtree incantation, further holy imbuement will amplify the effect and greatly increase the armament's power, and it does just that. Despite the fact that this weapon fits primarily in defensive builds, you can easily get it to over 1000 attack rating. At number 8 we have the Greatsword of Radahn Lord. I've already told you how good the new Greatsword of Radahn is when we covered the light variation, so the only thing I really need to add is that the Lord variation just takes that and makes it so much better by giving it an insanely powerful Ash of War. Throughout the duration of the Promise Consort's 3-input combo, Not only will you slash your enemies countless of times, but it will be accompanied by 6 columns of light, meaning you are hitting your enemy 13 times throughout this combo with both of your swords and all of the columns of light. Please note that the light pillars deal holy damage, however they scale off of intelligence, and a full combo will deal 52 stance damage, which is just a ridiculous amount for one Ash of War. Yes, it leaves you very vulnerable, and as you can see specifically against the Godskin duo fight here, I'm nearly dying many times, because I am completely disregarding my own life, because I know exactly how much damage this full combo is going to deal. And if you have the survivability to pull it off, you can just spam this against almost every enemy in the game with complete disregard for your own life, because they will die faster than you. It's as simple as that. This weapon is so powerful that for the most part you can just spam L2 and win the game. Next up, at number 7, we have got the best Great Spear in the game. Of course, which other weapon would it be? It is the Spear of the Impaler. It is Messmer's Great Spear. I could say pretty much all the same things about this weapon's Ash of War that I just said about the Great Sword of Radahn Lord's Ash of War, in that it's a huge combo with 3 consecutive attacks, striking around 10 times throughout its full duration. However, obviously, again, it leaves you very vulnerable to being attacked by enemies that aren't being staggered. But in most situations, that doesn't matter because its damage is so insanely powerful. However, the one thing that gives it a slight edge over the Great Sword of Radahn is its charged strong attack. In fact, the strong, dashing strong, and horseback strong attacks will all throw the spear as a ranged projectile for 0 FP. And unlike the Smith's Grip spear, the spear will even explode on impact, setting the ground on fire for a short period, dealing even more damage to your enemies, provided they don't move out of the pool of fire. It has an insane amount of range and can be targeted manually and thrown so far to snipe enemies from insane distances. This mechanic gives this weapon loads of utility, meaning it's effective at all ranges. However, please do note, if you do throw this weapon really far away, it is impacted by effective range, so it's not going to deal much damage to enemies if they're really far away, but it's still good at chipping away their health without them being able to do anything to you. And this is great for cheesing many enemies in the game. Because there is so much verticality in the DLC, you can outright kill so many enemies and mini-bosses without them even trying to fight back, by just throwing the Spear of the Impaler at them from a completely different area. It's so fun. And the final weapon before we get into the top 5, just narrowly missing out, though still very powerful, is the Backhand Blade. No, I'm not talking about the weapon type, the Backhand Blade, but the weapon that also shares the name of the weapon type, the Backhand Blade. Yeah, I know, confusing, right? They love to do that in this game. So, the Backhand Blade is the best of the Backhand Blades. It has slightly better scaling and damage than the Smith's Grip Cirque, and it also has a split between slash and pierce damage, meaning enemies are slightly resistant to some of its attacks, so it's usable in more situations and just far more versatile. Also, it has a longer range, so it effectively does everything that both of the Backhand Cirques do, but better in all categories. The Backhand Blade already is a fantastic category of weapon, and the Backhand Blade weapon itself just does it the best. It's as simple as that. Fantastic weapon category, fantastic weapon. It can be infused, it can be buffed, and due to its very standard scaling, it can be tailored for pretty much every build that you want. But my favourite combination for this weapon is to apply the Cold Affinity, because it gets really decent status build up, and it attacks really fast, so you're going to apply Frostbite on your enemies very quickly. So fast, in fact, as you can see here, the Crucible Knight is about to try and take off, and I managed to Frostbite him mid-flight and knock him out of the sky. Not many weapons attack fast enough to be able to pull off something like that. These weapons are just so fun, and they make you feel like an absolute ninja badass. And finally, my friends, we have come to the top 5 weapons in the entirety of Shadow of the Erdtree. What a long and crazy road it has been so far. I truly reckon a few of these picks are going to surprise you. They all cater to very different playstyles, which I think is perfect for the end of a list like this, because it means no matter what your personal playstyle is, I think one of these 5 weapons can easily be your new favourite. At number 5, we have got the Ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword. Initially, this sword appears to be an above-average colossal sword with a really good Ash of War. However, if you dig deep into how the stats work, you start to see that this has a never-ending potential. Firstly, because of how the physical attack and magical attack scaling work on this weapon, along with what actually buffs the Ash of War, it's not initially obvious which stats you should prefer and which talismans you should prefer. So let me give you a few really cool pieces of information. Firstly, you definitely want the Shard of Alexander on with this sword. It's the only talisman that will boost the Ash of War, which is a really good thing because it means you're not then tempted to sacrifice your survivability and your defense to just keep buffing the attack more and more and more and more with loads of different talismans. In fact, it's really good to just use the Shard of Alexander and then a bunch of survivability and defensive talismans. Because the White Light Charge Ash of War does such an insane amount of damage as it is anyway, it doesn't need to benefit from many more buffs. And I love that the follow-up attack has an AoE as well. That splash damage is crazy, and you're dealing 3,000 or 4,000 damage to so many enemies in the radius. And this is in the base game. This is without the Erdtree blessing. Yes, I know it's Erdtree, I cannot help it. It says Scadu. It just does. Anyway, another amazing thing to know about this weapon, because of how the weapon scaling works on this weapon, it's actually the arcane scaling that affects the physical damage portion of your attack rating the most, which means this is an incredibly potent weapon which will keep increasing in damage all the way up to pretty much 99 strength and 99 arcane, meaning it's one of the best weapons that you can bring into New Game Plus, because most weapons are going to plateau at around 60 of any stat. However, this is just going to keep increasing, and it's actually well worth using at really high level builds because it actually benefits from increasing your stats above the usual hard cap of 60. And to give you some more specifics, despite the fact that it says that the scaling for Arcane isn't that great, it will give you 3 or 4 points of attack rating per level all the way up to 50, and this is fantastic for status effect builds if you then want to pair this with certain spells and other weapons, because as you probably know by now, the more Arcane you have, the more status effect build up you have, so this synergizes really good with status effect builds. So for enemies that are then susceptible to things like Rot, Bleed and Frost, you have them options available to you. However, enemies that aren't, you can just switch back to just spamming that White Light Charge and dealing thousands upon thousands of raw damage. It's such a versatile weapon and fits in basically every build in the game, provided you have the strength to use it, because it does have quite a hefty requirement of 35 strength to wield one-handed. At number 4, you have got the Wing Stance. Sorry, I mean the Milady. Let's be honest. Primarily the reason you wanted to use the Milady is because you saw Wing Stance from the previews and thought it looked absolutely sick. And my friends, it is as powerful as it looked. This is primarily the only reason to use this weapon, and you don't really need any other reason. Just keep spamming L2, R2, and you will melt both the health and the stance of every single enemy in the game. And its moveset is only enhanced because of the fact that you can mix and match light and heavy attacks. This means that this weapon has a very high skill ceiling, especially for PvP, because certain combos are going to be far more effective than others. However, I'm sure, I have no idea, but I'm sure there must be a video by now on YouTube already of someone testing out all of the different light and heavy combos of the Light Greatsword moveset. And someone's probably already figured out the best combo for PvP and for PvE. If they have, go check it out and use that. But genuinely, I love just mixing up like light, heavy, light, heavy, light, light. There's just so many really stylish moves, and they are all super strong for so many different situations in the game, meaning you can pretty much counter everything simply with the right affinity, Wing Stance, and the standard Light Greatsword moveset. It's so simple, but so effective and deadly. As you can see from this Gideon fight, I died here. That's because I was trying to use the weapon that I've put in the number 2 slot, and it just was not cutting the mustard. So I decided to switch up the footage a bit and use the Milady here instead. And first try, I just wrecked his face. It was insane. He did not stand a chance against the speed and the power of this sword. As we move into number 3, people must be curious by now and have probably figured it out anyway. I said there was a theme to this video, there's something I was doing as I was progressing, and it's not anything secret or complex. But basically, I have been progressing through the game and basically like showing my character getting better and better and fighting harder and harder enemies as we go up this tier list. So with the worst weapon in the game, we are fresh out of the grave in Limgrave. We have no idea what we're doing. We're using crap weapons. We're barely scraping by killing enemies. And finally now, we are at the end of the game, fighting the final trio of bosses using some of the best weapons we have ever seen in Elden Ring. That was the theme of the video, is this progression and growing and learning and overcoming all the challenges as we get better and use better and better weapons. And in that vein, at number 3 is the Blood Fiend's arm. My god, did this make Malekith easy. Phase 1 of the fight was pretty easy, Phase 2 was literally stupid. So we'll let that play out as I talk to you about why the Blood Fiend's arm is so insanely powerful. People may be saying to me, why have you put this so high up on the list? Didn't it get nerfed recently? It did, and it's still one of the best weapons in the game. Before, it was really overpowered. It was actually broken. Now, it's just one of the best weapons in the game. And you'll find that that's a running theme for the final 3 weapons I have for you today. All 3 of them were previously literally broken, and FromSoft nerfed them. They're still the best weapons in the game. It's just now they are really, really, really powerful but fair, whereas before they were literally imbalanced and broken. And as you've just seen, the Blood Fiend's arm is one such example. When infused with Flame Art or Sacred, it's easily got one of the highest attack ratings in the game. And even though it doesn't have inherent blood loss buildup, its strong attack will cause a spray of blood, which will still cause blood loss on your enemies. Quite a lot, may I add, even if you haven't spec'd it into blood. Which means you don't even really need an Ash of War on this weapon. All you really need to do is give it Sacred or Flame Art Affinity to give it like 1200 attack rating, and then just spam charged heavy attacks, which will trigger bleed on enemies every other hit, and also stagger them every other hit. It's just an absolute beast of a colossal weapon. It's a genuine terror on the battlefield, even post-nerf. And if you did want to spec heavily into bleed and make that bleed even more powerful, you can do so, and its blood loss buildup can still get over 200 even after the nerf. Which I believe is still the most in the entire game. Just a really, really solid weapon in so many situations. Next up, the second best weapon in the game, and this makes me so happy because during my very first preview pre-release video, just after the event I did in the cathedral in Paris, I said, I don't like thrusting shields, I didn't find them very good, and I really hope someone will find a way to make them good. And now, the Carian thrusting shield, I truly believe, is the second best weapon in the whole of the game. By simply holding block and just spamming light attacks, you can easily go toe-to-toe with almost every single enemy in the game, as evidenced by easily wiping the floor with both Godfrey the First Elden Lord and his Phase 2 Hoaraloo Warrior. This boss on my first playthrough was a roadblock for me. He was really, really tough. I probably struggled with him more than any other boss in the game. More than Melania, more than Malekith. And now, with simply poking and prodding at him with a shield, I have trivialized him. The fact that this weapon can be buffed and infused means you can easily tailor it to whatever element the enemy you're currently facing is using, meaning you're even more resistant to it, and you're basically invincible as you're just poking and prodding them until they eventually die. My favourite thing to do with it, as you see here, is apply bleed, because it gets really good scaling, its damage is through the roof, and because it pokes and prods so quickly, you're applying that bleed build-up very, very fast, with well over 100 bleed on every single poke. As you see, I've been wrecking these Armour warriors as well, some of my most hated enemies from the base game. I used to really struggle with these guys as well, and now I can just stand here and poke them to death and take no damage. It's just ridiculous. The Carian thrusting shield is so strong. And again, please note, I am not even tailoring my build to these weapons. I'm not using buffs, I'm not using talismans. This could be so much more insane than what you are seeing in front of you right now. But now, enough stalling. Without further ado, let's discuss the absolute best weapon in the game, as we nearly no-hit Radagon and the Elden Beast with no preparation on the first try, with no attribute enhancing equipment, with no items, with no buffs, just the most powerful weapon in the game and a dream. And that weapon, my friends, is the Fire Knight's Greatsword. This is a drop from all of the Fire Knights that do wield this weapon, so you can easily go and farm this, shouldn't take you long to get one. And my friends, if you liked the Zweihander from the base game, this does everything the Zweihander does, but it turns it up to 100. It's stronger, it's got better scaling, it's got an incredibly awesome moveset. Even after the nerf that has stripped away the light attack into light attack true combo, it still has an incredibly cool moveset. I don't know for sure, as I'm not a stat geek, but I believe that it's even slightly quicker than most Colossal Swords as well, whilst being one of the most powerful. And due to the fact that it also has inherent fire damage and scales reasonably well with 3 different stats, this fits into every single build. And for a Colossal Sword, it's got really low stat requirements. If you're two-handing it, then the strength goes down to 15 instead of 22, so you only need 15 strength, 18 dex, and 12 faith, and you can wield the best Colossal Sword in the game. As you see, I've just melted the 2 final bosses with Cold Infusion, but really, this works with everything. Go mad with it. Put this in every single build. Change this to every single affinity and scaling that you want. It works no matter what you are running. It's just an absolute god tier weapon. And really, there's nothing more I can say about it. It's just incredible. So that's it, my friends. We are now at the end of ranking and rating every single weapon in the DLC. Again, thank you so much to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget you can play it for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox today by using my link in the pinned comment or the video description below. And remember, new and returning players who haven't played in 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack across all platforms, including multiple premium vehicles and other goodies, available for a limited time only, so make sure not to miss out. Oh, it's been fun, but the relief in my voice that I can finally stop talking. I've done hours and hours and hours of audio after my dozens and dozens of hours of research and testing. Oh god, if that doesn't deserve a like and a subscribe, my friends, I don't know what does. And with that, all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.